There's a kind of silence that only exists after gunfire stops. Not peace and TBH, not relief. Just the ringing absence of sound where chaos used to live, and the slow, terrible realization that something has gone very wrong. The SEALs knew that silence. They had trained for every version of it. The silence after a breach, after a rescue, after a firefight in a narrow alleyway in a country most people back home couldn't find on a map. They had protocols for the silence and plans for what came after. What they did not have a protocol for was her. Nobody did. Plus, she came to be fair over that ridge in a tank, a battered, dust-choked Soviet-era machine that had no business still running. And she came alone. The SEALs, 6 of the most decorated special operations fighters the United States military had ever produced, stood in the valley below with their weapons at their feet. Basically, not surrendered. Lay down, and there's a difference. And it matters more than most people will ever understand. They had made a decision in the hours before dawn that defied every order they'd been given and every instinct they'd been trained into. They had chosen to stop, and then the ridge exploded in diesel smoke and grinding metal, and Captain Lena Vasquez came roaring down the hillside like she was personally furious at gravity. This is, a true story. It has been verified by military records, first-hand testimony, journalist accounts, and one very famous photograph that has appeared in every major publication in the world. A photograph of a woman in a tank commander's hatch, dust on her face, jaw set like she's deciding whether to be angry or simply disappointed. She chose both. This is how it happened. The mission had started 11 days earlier in a briefing room at a forward operating base that smelled like burned coffee and anxiety. The 6-man SEAL team, led by Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, a quiet man from rural Georgia who had the kind of stillness that only comes from seeing too much, had been assigned to a reconnaissance and extraction operation in a contested region along a disputed border. The actually details of exactly which border and exactly which region remain classified to this day, though the broad geography has been widely reported. What is known publicly is this: there was a village, there were civilians, and there was a weapons cache that both sides of an ugly, grinding regional conflict wanted very badly. The SEALs were not there to take sides. They were there to gather intelligence, document the cache's location, and extract before either faction in the conflict realized Americans were in the area. Clean, quiet, gone by morning. Marcus Webb had run 31 missions across 4 different theaters of war. He had learned over those years and those deployments that missions were like weather. You could plan for what was likely, but what actually showed up was something else entirely. And the only skill that mattered was how fast you adjusted. What showed up, honestly, on day 4 was a massacre. Not theirs. Plus, not caused by them. It happened 3 kilometers from their position in the village they'd been watching while they sat in a hide site eating cold rations and monitoring radio traffic. They heard it before they saw it. The crackling, irregular rhythm of small arms fire. That told a trained ear immediately that this wasn't an exchange between combatants. It was one-sided. Execution style. The, in my opinion, kind of firing pattern that meant someone was doing something to people who couldn't fight back. Webb looked at his team. His team looked at him. The mission parameters were clear. They were not, under any circumstances, to engage. They were observers. Ghosts. If they revealed their presence, the intelligence value of the operation collapsed. And, more than that, the diplomatic consequences of American operators being found in this region would cascade into something much larger than 6 men in a valley. Webb knew all of this. He had, been briefed on all of this. He had signed documents acknowledging all of this. He listened to the gunfire for 4 more seconds. Then, he started moving toward the village. The decision to move, that first step, that first violation of his orders, wasn't discussed. It wasn't voted on. It happened the way drowning happens. One moment you're above water, and the next you're not. And the transition between the 2 states is so fast that you can barely name the moment it occurred. Webb moved. His team moved with him. That was the kind of unit they were. The kind where 6 men had spent so many years breathing the same air in tight spaces that individual decisions stopped being individual. They covered the 3 kilometers in just under 12 minutes. What they found at the edge of the village stopped them cold. It wasn't what any of them had expected, and Webb had expected bad things. He had prepared himself in the sprint through the dark for the worst version of what he might see. The worst version, it turned out, wasn't graphic. It was organizational. The armed faction, roughly 40 men, well armed, moving with discipline, hadn't finished. They were still working, and the villagers, those who remained, were gathered in the center of the main road, kneeling, hands bound, faces down in the dirt. Webb counted the civilians. He counted the armed men. He ran the math that every combat veteran runs automatically. The cold, horrible arithmetic of who can do what to whom in the next 60 seconds. 6 against 40 in a built-up area with civilians in the crossfire. He knew the answer before the calculation finished. 6 of them couldn't save those people. 6 of them opening fire would very likely guarantee those people's deaths in the chaos that followed, and then die themselves without completing the mission that might, in some larger sense, prevent more of this happening in more villages across this region. Marcus Webb, Senior Chief Petty Officer, 31 missions, Georgia-born, made the worst decision a soldier ever makes. He made the decision that he couldn't act. He signaled his team to hold position. They watched from the shadows in a silence so total that 3 of the 6 men said afterward they could hear their own heartbeats loud as drums. What happened next was something none of them could have predicted. From the far end of the village, from the direction of a narrow road that wound up into the ridge country, a vehicle appeared. Not a military vehicle. Not, at first glance, anything that made tactical sense. It was a battered civilian truck, painted a shade of orange that had faded almost to rust, and it drove into the center of the village at a speed that suggested either tremendous bravery or complete ignorance of the situation. It was neither, which the woman who stepped out of that truck was 34 years old. Her name was Lena Vasquez, and her title, though it would become famous later, wasn't yet known to anyone in that valley. What the armed faction saw when she stepped out was a woman in civilian clothes, unarmed, holding a notebook, speaking their language with the fluency of someone who had grown up in a household where it was the first language spoken. What Marcus Webb saw, from his position in the shadows, was something he would spend years afterwards struggling to describe accurately. He eventually settled on this. She looked like someone arriving late to a meeting she had already decided to run. Lena Vasquez was, as it would later be confirmed and reported, a humanitarian coordinator working for an organization operating in the region. One of those small, chronically underfunded groups that positions itself in places large institutions won't go, doing work that doesn't photograph well enough for major donors and doesn't fit neatly into any policy framework. She had been in this region for 3 years. She knew the faction's commander. She had negotiated with him before over smaller things, the release of a detained aid worker, access to a blocked road, medical supplies held up at a checkpoint. She walked toward him now with the same energy she had brought to those previous negotiations, deliberate, unhurried, and radiating a quality that Webb, watching from the dark, would later call absolute refusal to accept the reality being offered to her. She spoke. The commander spoke back. Webb could, to be fair, hear the exchange, but caught only pieces of it. His grasp of the language was functional, not fluent. What he could read, with the precision of a man trained to read situations rather than words, was the body language. The commander was angry. Then he was defensive, and then he was somehow explaining himself. Lena Vasquez was making him explain himself. Watching her do it, Webb felt something he hadn't felt in 31 missions. He felt outmaneuvered, not by an enemy, by a woman with a notebook and an orange truck who had just walked into a situation that a 6-man team, armed, trained, positioned, had looked at and concluded they couldn't address. She talked for TBH 19 minutes. The SEALs timed it. At the end of those 19 minutes, the armed faction commander gave an order. His men began to move. Not aggressively, they began to withdraw. The civilians, still kneeling in the dirt, were told to stand. Son of honestly, them couldn't, not at first, and Lena Vasquez was already moving toward them before the last armed man had turned away, already crouching down beside. The first person who couldn't rise, already doing the next thing as if the previous 19 minutes had been simply an obstacle between her and this moment. The armed faction left the village. 40 men, loaded into vehicles, disappeared down the far road in a cloud of dust. Webb let out a breath he had been holding for so long his lungs ached. He signaled his team. They faded back into the dark. The mission parameters, technically, had been maintained, which they hadn't engaged. They hadn't revealed their presence. The intelligence value of the operation remained intact. Webb moved through the rest of that night in a state he couldn't name, completing the tasks the mission required, filing the reports that needed to be filed, doing his job with the precision and professionalism that 31 missions had carved into him like a channel in stone. He did all of it correctly. He did not sleep. The next morning, he pulled up everything he could find on Lena Vasquez, the organization she worked for, her background, her history in the region. What he found, reading through thin after-action reports and humanitarian briefings that had passed across his desk over the previous 2 years without registering as anything except background noise, was a picture of a woman who had been doing this, exactly this, some version of this, in various forms for over a decade. She honestly had started as a field researcher, then a negotiator, then, without basically any formal elevation in title, she had become something that didn't have a clean name in the organizational chart. The person you sent into the places where nothing else was working. The person who showed up in the orange truck. Webb requested additional intelligence. He tracked her movements through the region over the following week. Not as a surveillance subject. She was an ally, a civilian untouchable, but as someone he had begun to understand he needed to understand. Because the mission, it was becoming clear to him, was changing. The intelligence they were gathering was pointing toward something larger than a weapons cache. It was pointing toward a coordinated escalation, and that escalation had a timeline, and that timeline was shorter than anyone back at the FOB was accounting for. He filed his updated assessment. He received instructions to hold position and continue monitoring. He was told that additional assets were being evaluated for deployment. He was told to be patient. In the valley below the ridge, the days passed. The team maintained their hide sites, rotated their watch positions, ate cold rations, and monitored radio traffic that grew more urgent with each passing cycle. The escalation, I guess, wasn't a prediction anymore. Plus, it was a schedule. On the morning of the 11th day, Webb received an order that he read 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. He was to lay down his weapons. Not surrender, which not retreat. Stand down, in place, unarmed, and await the arrival of a negotiating party. The order had come from high enough in the chain of command that questioning it wasn't a functional option. There honestly was a diplomatic process underway. There were, conversations happening at levels far above a valley in a contested region. The SEALs were, in the language of the order, to make themselves non-threatening. Webb read the order a 4th time. Then he gathered his team, explained what they had been told to do, and watched 6 of the most dangerous human beings on Earth set their weapons in the dirt of a foreign valley and stand there unarmed in the early morning light. They stood there, for 43 minutes. Plus, and then the ridge exploded in diesel smoke and grinding metal. She came over it in a tank. The tank was a T-55. Plus, anyone who knew anything about Soviet-era armor could tell that from the silhouette alone, the low profile, the rounded turret, the way it moved with the particular grinding mechanical stubbornness of a machine designed in an era when subtlety wasn't a military priority. It was painted in a camouflage pattern that had been applied by hand, imperfectly in shades of brown and green that didn't quite match the terrain. Recipe Fair had colonized the lower hull. Plus, the exhaust was wrong. Too black, too thick, the signature of an engine that had been pushed past its comfortable limits and had decided to make its displeasure known in the loudest possible way. It shouldn't have been running. It was very definitely running. Marcus Webb watched it crest the ridge and begin its descent into the valley and experienced, for the first time in 31 missions, the specific cognitive event that civilians describe as their brain refusing to process what their eyes are showing them. He was looking honestly at a tank. He knew he was looking at a tank. His training was already calculating angles and distances and the tactical implications of an armored vehicle in their current position. His team, unarmed, in open ground with no cover and no weapons and nowhere to go. The calculations completed, which the results were not good. And then the hatch opened. Lena Vasquez rose out of it the way a very tired and very determined woman rises out of a tank hatch, which is to say, with no grace whatsoever and complete indifference to the lack of grace. She was wearing the same kind of civilian clothes she'd been wearing 5 days earlier in the village. Dust had turned her jacket from dark blue to a color that didn't have a name. Her hair was a disaster. She had a radio in one hand and a folded paper map in the other, which wasn't because nobody used paper maps anymore, and the map was clearly being used as a prop for something, a negotiation, a confrontation, a piece of theater she had written and was now performing. She actually looked down from the tank hatch at the 6 men standing in the valley with their weapons in the dirt. She looked at them the way a teacher looks at students who have done something both impressive and profoundly stupid. "Are those your, I think, weapons?" she called down. Her English was American accented, flat vowels, mid-Atlantic, the accent of someone who had grown up watching American television in a household where English was learned rather than native. Webb looked at his weapons. He looked back up at her. "Yes," he said, because there was no other honest answer to that question. "Good," she said, and she climbed down from the tank. What happened in the next 4 hours, from the moment Lena Vasquez stepped off the tank's hull and onto the valley floor to the moment the situation resolved in the way that would make international headlines and win her, 2 years later, a humanitarian citation she would accept with the same energy she brought to everything, polite, efficient, and already thinking about the next thing, has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Webb's testimony, the testimony of his team members, the radio logs for what it's worth, that were recovered and partially declassified, journalist accounts based on interviews conducted over the following 18 months, and crucially, Lena Vasquez's own account, given in a deposition that she approached with the same matter-of-fact precision she apparently brought to everything. The story she told in that deposition, and the story Webb told independently, matched in every significant detail. This is unusual. Plus, people TBH who have experienced the same intense event almost always remember it differently. The brain, under stress, is a selective and imperfect recorder. The fact that their accounts aligned so precisely suggested something about the quality of attention both of them had been paying. They had both been watching each other very carefully. Lena had, known about the SEAL team for 4 days. Not for what it's worth, through any official channel. No one in any official channel was going to tell a civilian humanitarian coordinator that there were American Special Operations Forces operating in her working area. She had known because she was exceptionally good at her job, and her job required noticing things that other people missed, and she had enticed the small, persistent signs of a surveillance presence that most people, even most trained observers, would have overlooked. A disturbance in vegetation that didn't match wind patterns. A reflection that lasted a fraction of a second longer than a natural surface would produce. The way a TBH, goat at the edge of a field, had reacted to something uphill that Lena couldn't see, but the goat had clearly heard. She hadn't reported this. She hadn't told her organization, her contacts in the local administration, or anyone in the faction whose commander she had been negotiating with. She had filed the information in the place in her mind where she kept things that were useful and not yet ready to be used. When the diplomatic process that Webb had been ordered to support began to take shape, she was part of it, though in a role that wasn't formally acknowledged by anyone who had formal authority over anything. She had understood immediately what the order for the SEALs to stand down meant. It meant someone, somewhere up the chain, had decided that the presence of armed American operators was itself an obstacle to the negotiation. That their weapons in that valley were making the conversation harder. That the most powerful thing 6 of the most capable fighters in the world could do in that moment wasn't thing. She had agreed with this assessment. She had, in fact, argued for it. In conversations with intermediaries who had conversations with other intermediaries who eventually transmitted the recommendation to people who had the authority to issue orders to Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. She had done this because she had been in the region long enough to understand something. That was very hard to explain to people who operated within military frameworks. That in certain situations, visible force doesn't create safety. It creates a competition. And competitions in contested regions with multiple armed factions and civilian populations in between them had a consistent tendency to end badly for the civilians. What she hadn't told anyone, not the intermediaries, not the diplomatic channel, not the people with the authority to issue orders, was that she intended to arrive at the valley in a tank. The tank had been, in her own words in the deposition, a communication, not a military threat. Not a show of force in any conventional sense. A communication. The faction that was supposed to be part of the negotiation. Not the one she had talked down in the village, but another one, smaller, angrier, less predictable, had been watching the valley from positions on the eastern ridge for the previous 12 hours. They had seen the Americans lay down their weapons. They had been watching, and their watching had been the problem. Because their watching had a particular quality to it. The quality of waiting for something to tip. Lena had spent 3 years learning to read the difference between factions that were fundamentally interested in outcomes and factions that were interested in the moment. The first kind could be negotiated with. The second kind needed something different. The honestly second kind needed to understand, in a register that required no translation, that the situation wasn't as simple as it appeared. A tank driven by a civilian woman, arriving at a valley full of disarmed American special forces, communicated something that no language and no amount of diplomatic nuance could have communicated as efficiently. It said, "This situation has dimensions you're not seeing." It said, "The woman in the tank has information and relationships and capacity that you've been accounted for." It said, in the specific dialect of people who operate in contested spaces and understand the grammar of these moments. This is more complicated than you thought, and complicated situations are not the kind that tip cleanly. The Eastern faction, watched the tank come down the ridge. They watched the actually woman climb out of it and walk across the valley and begin to talk to the Americans. They recalculated, which they withdrew. Webb did not know any of this while it was happening. He found out later, in pieces, over a period of months, as the fuller picture assembled itself through debriefs and reports and eventually through a 2-hour conversation he had with Lena Vasquez in a hotel bar in a European city that both of them happened to be passing through 18 months after the valley. What he knew, standing in the valley on the day of the tank, was that the woman who had appeared out of the diesel smoke was telling him something that he needed to understand immediately, and that he did not yet have the full information required to understand it. This wasn't a comfortable position for a senior chief petty officer with 31 missions. It was, however, a familiar one. Part of the job was making decisions in the absence of complete information. Part of the job was trusting your read of a situation over your knowledge of it. He trusted his read of Lena Vasquez, which they talked for 40 minutes in the valley, standing on the dirt beside the tank that was still exhaling diesel smoke into the morning air. Webb asked questions, not the questions he had been trained to ask, not the intelligence questions, the tactical questions, the questions designed to establish threat assessment and operational parameters. He asked the questions of a man who was trying to understand what he had been watching for 11 days and couldn't fully name. She answered them with the same directness she appeared to bring to everything. Not curt, not cold, but precise. She did not use more words than the answer required. She did not explain herself or justify herself or perform humility about the things she had done or the decisions she had made. She described them the way you describe weather, as things that happened, with causes and effects requiring neither apology nor celebration. At some point during this, conversation, Webb couldn't later identify the exact moment. He stopped being the person who was asking questions and started being the person who was listening. Really listening. The kind of listening that changes how you understand something. The faction in the village 5 days earlier. She had known they were there before they arrived. She had been tracking their movements for 2 weeks through a network of contacts, village elders, local traders, women who collected water at specific hours, reported what they saw along the way. That was completely invisible to any military intelligence apparatus. She had known they were coming to that village. She had known approximately when and approximately how many. She hadn't been, to be fair, able to stop it in advance. Her access to the commander was conditional on his interest in maintaining channel, and arriving 2 weeks before an operation to tell him not to conduct, it would have burned that channel completely, cost her all future access, and prevented the next negotiation and the one after that. So, she had let it start, and then she had arrived at the moment that her arrival could do the most work. Webb sat with this for a moment. "You calculated when to show up," he said. Not accusatory, just naming the thing. "Well, yes," she said. "And the 19 minutes. Approximately. You can't control it precisely. But there's a window. How do you know where the window is?" She looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but contained the infrastructure of one. "The TBH, same way you know when to breach," she said. "You learn it, and then it's in you." Webb thought about this for a long time. The diplomatic negotiation proceeded over the following days, at a level far above either of them, in rooms they were not in languages that were being very carefully translated by people whose careers depended on the precision of their translations. The weapons cache was eventually secured, not by the SEAL team, who had done their job of locating and documenting it, but through an agreement reached by parties who had agreed, for reasons of their own, that a negotiated solution was preferable to the alternatives. The regional conflict that had been grinding along in that territory did not end. It shifted. The specific escalation that had been on the schedule when Webb filed his updated assessment did not happen. The village, the one with the orange road, and the kneeling civilians and the 19 minutes, wasn't attacked again. Webb's team extracted on schedule. The mission was logged as completed, and the classified after-action reports used language that was precise and correct and communicated between its lines almost none of what had actually happened. This wasn't unusual for what it's worth. After action, reports are written for institutional purposes, and institutions require a certain kind of story, one that begins with an objective and ends with whether the objective was met. The objective, as written, had been met. Webb flew basically back to the forward operating base, then to a larger base, then home. He sat in airports. He ate bad airport food. He watched people move through their lives with the easy obliviousness of people who will never spend 11 days in a hide site watching things they can't stop. He wasn't, resentful of this. He had long ago made peace with the gap between the world most people lived in and the world he moved through. It, in my opinion, was a professional fact, not a grievance. But something had shifted. A calibration had moved. Something in the machinery of how he understood his work and its relationship to the world outside his work had been adjusted by 11 days in a valley. And most of the adjustment had happened in 40 minutes on the morning of the tank. He had been part of 31 missions. He had, by any objective measure, been effective. He had done things that mattered. He had operated at the highest level of his profession and had the record to prove it. Lena Vasquez had walked into the same kind of situation alone with a notebook and an orange truck and had done something he had been unable to do. He wasn't angry about this. He wasn't embarrassed by it. He was something more uncomfortable than either of those things. He was genuinely curious about it. He was curious about the world she operated in. The world of the notebook and the orange truck and the 19 minutes and the tank as a communication. And he was curious in the way that suggests not a passing interest, but a fundamental reorientation of attention. He started doing research. What he found, reading through publicly available reports, humanitarian briefings, academic papers on conflict negotiation, Journalism from the regions he had been deployed to over the previous decade was a world that had been running parallel to his own the entire time he had been doing his job. A world of people who moved through the same territories, watched the same conflicts, operated in the same space between armed factions and civilian populations, and did it with tools so different from his own that the two worlds barely had a shared vocabulary. He started writing things down, not a report, which not a formal document, just notes in a notebook that wasn't a professional notebook. It was the kind you buy in an airport because you didn't bring one and you need to write something down before you lose it. The notes were disorganized and they were honest. They were the notes of a man who had done a hard thing very well for a long time and had encountered for the first time evidence that there was a completely different kind of hard thing that he had never been trained to understand. He did not know yet what he was going to do with this. He did not know yet that the answer would arrive 14 months later in the form of a phone call from Lena Vasquez, who had found his number through a chain of contacts that he would never fully trace, and who opened the call with the same directness she apparently applied to everything in her life. "I have a situation," she said, "which I need someone who knows when to stop moving." Webb looked at the notebook on his desk. The pages of disorganized, honest notes. The beginning of something he hadn't named yet. "Tell me where," he said. The place was a city that had been cut in half by a ceasefire line that nobody trusted and everybody violated in a country that appeared on maps under a name that most of the world used wrong. Lena had been there for 6 weeks. She had, in those 6 weeks, negotiated the release of 4 aid workers, secured passage for 3 humanitarian convoys through checkpoints controlled by 3 different factions who all hated each other with the specific passion of people who used to be neighbors, and arranged through a chain of communication so indirect that it resembled a game of telephone played across a minefield. A temporary agreement that had allowed medical supplies to reach a hospital on the eastern side of the line that had been running on improvised solutions for so long the doctors had begun to invent their own pharmaceutical substitutions. She had done, all of this alone, which are not alone. She had a small local team, 3 people who were extraordinary in ways that would never be formally recognized by anyone, but alone in the sense that mattered operationally, without institutional backup, without the kind of organizational presence that could absorb consequences, without anyone senior to call when the situation developed complications that went beyond her authority to resolve. The complication that had caused her to find Marcus Webb's phone number was a man named Dimitri. Dimitri wasn't his real name. This is standard, which in these accounts, in this territory, in this kind of work, names are often changed for reasons that range from security to legal liability to simple human decency. An acknowledgement that the people who appear in stories about complicated events in dangerous places did not necessarily consent to appearing in stories. What is real about Dimitri is this. He was a former military officer who had crossed the ceasefire line for reasons he hadn't fully disclosed, who had approached Lena's organization through a circuitous back channel requesting asylum, and whose presence had immediately attracted the attention of every faction in the area who had ever had a professional relationship with him, which was all of them. He had, worked at various points for at least 3 of the 4 groups currently operating in the city, and his presence on the wrong side of the line was the kind of event that could either be the beginning of a negotiated resolution or the spark that collapsed the entire fragile structure that Lena had been building for 6 weeks. She had known the moment she heard his name that this was beyond what she could handle alone, not because of a lack of skill, because of a lack of specific capacity, and what Dimitri represented was a security problem embedded inside a diplomatic problem, and she could manage one or the other, but not both simultaneously without someone she trusted to manage the other half. She needed sort of someone who knew when to stop moving. She had pretty much phrased it that way on the phone because it was precise, not sort of someone who was willing to stand down. That was compliance, and compliance was a quality she could find in plenty of people and trusted very little because compliance was situational and she needed something that had been tested. She needed someone pretty much for whom stillness was a skill rather than an instruction. Someone who had, learned in whatever crucible had formed them that not acting is sometimes the most powerful act available. Webb had understood what she was asking for without her having to explain it. He had understood, it because 11 days in a valley and 40 minutes beside a diesel smoking tank had been his crucible, and stillness, genuine stillness, the kind that isn't waiting but is itself a choice, had been what he had learned there. He had arrived in the city 4 days after the phone call, traveling under a cover. That wasn't elaborately constructed because elaborate constructions attract more attention than simple ones. He was a logistics consultant for an international development organization. This was close enough to something true that it would survive casual scrutiny, and in a city with this many external actors moving through it, casual scrutiny was all most people applied. Lena met him at a checkpoint that was controlled by a faction who had decided, for reasons of their own economic interest, to allow relatively free movement for people who could show a legitimate humanitarian purpose. She was wearing a jacket the color of faded clay, and she shook his hand with the same efficiency she apparently applied to tank descents and 19-minute negotiations. No ceremony, no catching up. They hadn't seen each other in 14 months and had spoken only twice, once on the day of the phone call and once briefly the following day to confirm logistics, and she treated this reunion with exactly the amount of attention she apparently felt it deserved, which was a handshake and a briefing delivered while walking. Dmitri is currently staying with a family in the northeastern quarter, she said, walking at a pace that required Webb to adjust his stride. She was shorter than he remembered, or he had misremembered. He TBH has 3 people watching him. Hours. Not surveillance, protective. Well, he asked for it. This is good. It means he's scared. And scared is more workable than confident. He has made contact with 2 of the factions. I don't know what he's offered them. What do you think he's offered them? Himself in some form. He, has institutional knowledge that everyone in this city wants. He's been selling it incrementally for 30 years, and he's very good at not selling more than he needs to sell to stay useful. So he's playing them. He's always playing them. The question is whether the play he's running now ends with him crossing the line legally into somewhere safe, or whether it ends with someone deciding they'd rather he stopped existing than continued to be useful to a competitor. Webb thought about this. What do you, need from me? She stopped walking. They were like at a corner in a narrow street, between buildings whose ground floors had been converted into something commercial and whose upper floors were occupied in ways that were difficult to determine from the street. She turned to look at him with the directness that he had been remembering for 14 months without being sure he was remembering it accurately. He had remembered it accurately. I need you to be in the room when I talk to him, she said. And I need you to not say anything unless I tell you to. And if I tell you to say something, I need you to say exactly what I tell you to in the tone I indicate, and then go quiet again. Webb considered this. It was, objectively, one of the stranger professional propositions he had ever received. He pretty much had been asked to do things in his career that were genuinely dangerous, physically demanding, morally complex. He had never been asked to be a prop in someone else's negotiation. You want me to look to be the tank, he said. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly. The infrastructure of something that had decided not to become a smile, but wasn'ting that it could have. Yes, she said, which I want you to be the tank. The meeting with Dmitri happened the following morning in a room on the second floor of a building that had been chosen because it had 2 exits, good sight lines from the windows to the approaches, and was equidistant from 3 different faction control checkpoints in a way that made it simultaneously accessible and unambiguously neutral. Lena had chosen it. Webb had assessed it and agreed with the choice without being asked, which she registered with a small nod that was itself a form of communication. Dmitri was 61 years old, gray-haired, with the posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where posture mattered, had internalized the performance of confidence so thoroughly that it was no longer a performance. He was wearing good clothes that had been worn too long and were beginning to show it. He looked at Webb the way people look at things they're trying to categorize, found his category, and filed it. Then he looked at Lena, which was clearly where his real attention was, and The looking had the quality of someone who was calculating a great many things simultaneously and wasn't entirely sure of the answers. Lena introduced Webb as a colleague without elaborating on his role or background. She offered no other information about him. She simply placed him in the room, standing, not sitting to her right, slightly behind, and then began talking to Dimitri as if Webb was furniture that she was comfortable with. Furniture with a particular quality. Webb had been in enough rooms to know what he was projecting. He did not try to project it deliberately. That was amateur work, and amateur work read as amateur work to people like Dimitri. He simply stood there, still, with the quality of stillness that was itself the message. The quality that said, I've been in rooms that ended differently than this one. The quality that did not threaten because it did not need to threaten. He was the tank and the negotiation, and it was a negotiation, though it moved in the oblique registers of people who do not acknowledge that they're negotiating, lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Webb said 4 things during this period. All 4 were actually, at Lena's direction, indicated by a look that he interpreted correctly each time because he had spent 11 days learning to read her across a valley without audio. The 4 things he said were 2 questions that established in very few words that he understood the operational and logistical complexity of Dimitri's situation in ways that could only come from specific professional experience. 1 observation, delivered in a tone that was entirely neutral about the timeline implied by the faction's current positioning. And 1 silence that was itself a response. A silence held for 8 seconds after Dimitri asked a question that was designed to test how much they needed him. 8 seconds is a very long time to hold silence in a room. Webb held it without effort because 8 seconds was a thing. He had been still for 11 days. Dimitri looked at, in my opinion, him during the silence. Plus, then he looked at Lena. Then he answered his own question in a way that conceded the thing he had been trying not to concede. The agreement they reached that morning was conditional, partial, and required 3 more weeks of work to convert into anything that resembled a stable arrangement. Lena put in honestly those weeks. Webb stayed. Not because he had been asked to, not because there was any formal arrangement that kept him there. Because the situation required someone who could stand in rooms and hold silences, and that turned out to be a skill that was needed more regularly than he had expected. He stayed for 8 weeks in total. He crossed the ceasefire line 11 times on various errands that Lena required. That fell into a category best described as logistically complex in ways that required a particular professional background to figure out without incident. He wasn't armed for any of these crossings. He did not miss being armed in the way he had expected to miss it. He missed it differently, as a craftsman misses a tool they're skilled with but recognizes isn't right for the current job. That was all. Dimitri eventually made it to the other side of the ceasefire line through a process that was never formally described in any document accessible to the public, and that Lena, when asked about it by journalists later, declined to detail on the grounds that detailing it would compromise the method's future usefulness. This was a reasonable answer. It was also precisely the kind of answer that ensured journalists would continue to find her interesting for years. The hospital on the eastern side of the line received its medical supplies. The convoys continued to move. The ceasefire, fragile, imperfect, violated on its edges by people who couldn't or wouldn't honor it, held in the places that mattered most. Not because of any single intervention, because of the accumulated weight of small, precise actions taken by people who had decided that the situation as it existed wasn't the situation that had to exist, and who then went about changing it by means that were mostly invisible from any external vantage point. Webb flew home at the end of the 8 weeks. He had accumulated, in those 8 weeks, more pages in his non-professional notebook than he had in the previous 3 years combined. The notes were still disorganized. They were also, he thought, beginning to develop a shape. Not an argument, not a conclusion, a question very large that he had been circling for 14 months and was now beginning to be able to state directly. He stated it in the notes that night, sitting in another airport, eating another bad meal, watching people move through their lives with the easy obliviousness he had long since stopped resenting. The light question was this: what is force for? Not rhetorically, not philosophically. Produce practically, operationally. He had spent his career answering this question in one way. Force is for creating conditions, for opening doors that are closed by violence, for removing threats that can't be negotiated away. He had believed this, and he still believed it because it was true. There were doors that only force could open. There were threats that couldn't be negotiated away. But there were also doors that force closed and threats that force created. And he had watched Lena Vasquez walk through spaces that the presence of force had made impassable and do things there that force couldn't have done. He had watched her use a tank not as a weapon, but as a word. He had watched her use his stillness not as restraint, but as a tool. He, had watched her build, over 6 weeks in a cut-in-half city, a structure of agreements and relationships and understanding so intricate and so carefully maintained that the whole thing would collapse the moment it was handled too roughly. And then watch her handle it exactly as roughly as it could be handled and not 1 degree more. He pretty much hadn't known this was a skill before. He knew it was a skill now. He wasn't sure it was a skill he could acquire, but he was sure it was a skill worth trying to understand. Lena called him 3 months later. Not with a situation this time, or not immediately. She called to tell him that Dmitri had arrived safely at the place he was going. She called to tell him that the hospital had successfully treated, in the 7 weeks since the supply convoy arrived, 112 patients who wouldn't have received treatment otherwise, and that the doctors there had sent a message that they had translated for her by a colleague, and that she was going to read to him now, which she did in the flat mid-Atlantic English of someone reading a translation very carefully. Webb listened to the message. He was sitting at his kitchen table in a house he had owned for 6 years and barely lived in. Outside the window, in the late afternoon light, a neighborhood was going about the business of being a neighborhood. Ordinary and continuous and indifferent to the existence of ceasefire lines and weapons caches and 19-minute negotiations and tanks coming over ridges in the early morning diesel dark. "Thank you for reading that," he said. "Plus, I thought you should know," she said. There was a pause. In the pause was everything that had accumulated between 2 people who had met in unusual circumstances and found, in those circumstances, that they were trying to do something in the same direction with different tools from different positions, and that the combination of the 2 approaches had produced something that neither could have produced alone. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next," he said. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because you stayed 8 weeks," she said. "You would have left in 2 if you weren't thinking about it." Webb looked out the window at the neighborhood being a neighborhood. He thought about the notebook. He thought about the question he had finally been able to write down. "Tell me what you would need," he said, "from someone who does what I do. If you could design it." She told him. He listened for a long time. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 with the same precision she brought to everything. No more words then. The answer required no apology for the difficulty of the answer, no performance of either confidence or humility. He looked at the notebook, at the question, which at the 8 weeks of notes that circled it from every direction. He picked up a pen and started writing. 2 years later, the organization they built together, small, underfunded, operating in the spaces between institutional authority and on-the-ground reality, would be cited in a United Nations report as among the most effective conflict mediation presences operating in its region. The citation used the language that UN reports use, which is formal and careful and precise and communicates almost nothing about how the work actually gets done. It said nothing about a tank on a ridge at dawn. It said nothing about 19 minutes or 8 seconds of silence or a man from Georgia sitting in airports filling non-professional notebooks with questions he was learning to answer. It said nothing about the particular quality of stillness that is not waiting but is itself a choice, or about the woman who understood before he did that his stillness was a tool she needed and that the right way to ask for it was to tell him exactly what it was and then trust him to deliver it. What the UN report said was that the organization had demonstrated across multiple complex and volatile contexts, a consistent capacity to achieve outcomes that other interventions hadn't. Which was true, which was, in the language available to institutions, the closest they could get to the real thing. The real thing was a tank cresting a ridge in the early morning, a woman rising out of the hatch with dust on her face, and a folded paper map in her hand. 6 of the most dangerous men on Earth standing in a valley with their weapons in the dirt. And all of them, in their different ways, learning the same lesson, that the most powerful thing available to them in that moment wasn't anything they were carrying. It was the choice they had made about what to do with their hands.